The Nazis never imagined that the most dangerous Allied weapon of the war wouldn't roar like a tank, soar like a bomber, or detonate like 1,000 pounds of TNT, but instead would hum quietly inside a dimly lit British estate where mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, and eccentric geniuses worked in silence. And the story begins in 1939. Long before the world understood just how decisive intelligence would become, when Germany's encrypted communications, sent through the Enigma machine, moved across Europe in a coded rhythm that commanders trusted completely, believing their messages were unreadable, unbreakable, untouchable. Yet in the shadows of Bletchley Park, a mismatched group of minds assembled under complete secrecy, where Alan Turing, Dilly Knox, Gordon Welchman, and countless unnamed women operators of the Women's Royal Naval Service sat beside clattering Type-X machines and endless paper rolls, knowing that every character they decoded could save ships, save convoys, save entire nations. And as war ignited across Europe, Poland falling, France collapsing, Britain bracing for invasion, the work intensified until it became the heartbeat of Allied survival, because while German U-boats hunted the Atlantic in wolfpacks, stalking merchant convoys carrying food, oil, aircraft parts, medicine, and the oxygen of Britain's war effort, the only thing preventing disaster was the race happening inside wooden huts tucked behind hedges and gardens, where the codebreakers fought not with weapons but with logic, memory, and sleepless concentration. And every time a message cracked, an Allied commander somewhere received orders that shifted the battlefield, redirected a fleet, or warned a convoy before German torpedoes struck. And as Britain endured the Blitz, cities burning, factories rattled, families sheltering from the nightly howl of Luftwaffe bombers, the quiet war at Bletchley grew even more vital. Because the Allies had begun noticing a disturbing pattern. The Germans always seemed confident, always certain of timing, always coordinated with precision, and it became clear that cracking Enigma wasn't simply helpful, it was the only way to survive, for without these intercepted messages, the Atlantic would be a graveyard, North Africa would be lost, the skies would belong entirely to the Reich. Yet what the Nazis didn't know was that every confident message they sent, every order they relayed, every patrol they scheduled, was slowly being turned against them, and the fear among German officers began quietly, whispered between Kriegsmarine captains who couldn't understand why their U-boats, once the terror of the seas, were suddenly being hunted, tracked, and ambushed by aircraft and destroyers before they ever reached firing position. And Captain Karl Donitz, mastermind of the U-boat fleet, paced maps late into the night, insisting there must be spies in ports, traitors in the ranks, leaks in the chain of command, never imagining that somewhere in England, a man he'd never heard of, Alan Turing, was building a machine capable of unspooling the Reich's secrets faster than operators could type them. While at sea, the Battle of the Atlantic grew more desperate, with German submarines striking in Black May, sinking 120 ships, believing victory was close. But behind every German success, another coded message traveled through the airwaves, waiting to be intercepted, waiting to be solved, waiting to save the next convoy. And Bletchley Park, though far from the front lines, vibrated with the intensity of a battlefield, where operators drank endless cups of weak British tea, worked shifts that blurred into nights, slept on benches between decrypt cycles, all knowing that if they failed, men at sea would die, entire convoys would vanish beneath the waves, whole offensives could collapse. And as the months passed, the Allies turned code breaking into a weapon as powerful as any artillery piece, because each time Enigma fell, it rewrote strategy. In the deserts of North Africa, Rommel's fuel shipments were intercepted. In the Arctic, convoys dodged U-boats hiding beneath freezing waters. In Europe, troop movements were predicted with uncanny accuracy, terrifying German commanders who couldn't understand how invisible eyes always watched them, always anticipated their next step. And though the Nazis desperately upgraded Enigma, adding more rotors, increasing settings, tightening procedure, it was never enough. Because the codebreakers evolved too, designing more complex bombs, processing thousands of cipher permutations in hours, shrinking what once took days into minutes, and the psychological weight of this silent supremacy began to spread through the Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht, the Kriegsmarine, until entire operations failed before they began, leaving German officers confused and frustrated as if fate itself had turned against them. But it wasn't fate, just a group of quiet, exhausted, brilliant minds decoding the war one message at a time. And as 1942 progressed, the intelligence war expanded into the Pacific, into North Africa, into the Mediterranean, yet the most dramatic effects remained in the Atlantic, where the U-boats, the pride of Hitler's strategy, found themselves ambushed by destroyers emerging from fog banks, depth charges falling with uncanny timing, Allied aircraft appearing from empty skies in places where German captains swore they could not possibly be detected, fueling rumors among U-boat crews that the British possessed some supernatural power, a radar that could see through the sea, a ghostly network of spies, or even divine intervention guiding their enemies. And through it all, Bletchley Park never celebrated, never revealed, never paused, because the war was far from over, and each new Enigma setting meant another sleepless night, another round of logic, another chance to collapse under the pressure. But they continued, driven by a simple truth: if they crack the next code, they might save thousands, shift the balance, perhaps even shorten the war itself. Before we continue, please let me know, did anyone in your family fight in or live through World War II? Share their stories in the comments. Let's continue the story. And as 1943 dawned, with the German war machine still stretching across Europe, Bletchley Park reached a level of efficiency and brilliance that stunned even the commanders who depended on its secrets, for the Codebreakers had become so skilled at reading Enigma that entire German naval operations were mapped before they even began, allowing the Allies to move like an army of ghosts, appearing exactly where the Germans least expected them. And nowhere was this more evident than in the turning tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, where Allied convoys sailed with increasing confidence, shielded by information so precise that British admirals demanded to know the source, only to be told vaguely that a reliable intelligence service had provided the details, because the true origins, the quiet rooms, the pencil marks, the paper slips, the spinning rotors, could never be revealed, not even to the very men using the information to win battles. And this secrecy extended to Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself, who visited Bletchley Park late at night, walking past lines of young women punching ciphers into machines, past engineers adjusting circuits, past mathematicians scribbling frantic equations, knowing he was witnessing something extraordinary, perhaps the most important weapon Britain possessed. And Churchill famously told them, "You have shortened the war by years," though even that was an understatement, for their influence stretched further than anyone could measure. And while Churchill spoke inspiring words inside Bletchley, the atmosphere remained tense. Every day a new challenge, every morning a new cipher, every hour a race against death. Because if the Germans changed their codes just slightly, the entire system could collapse, the Atlantic could fall into darkness once again, convoys could be massacred, and all the fragile advantages would crumble. So the pressure never lifted. Not even for a moment. Yet amidst this pressure came one of the most decisive breakthroughs of the war, the cracking of the Kriegsmarine's shark cipher used by the most advanced U-boats operating in the mid-Atlantic Gap, a vast stretch of ocean so far from land that Allied aircraft couldn't reach it, a place the Germans called the Black Pit, where U-boats hunted freely, sinking ships with near impunity. But once Shark fell, once the Codebreakers unlocked its secrets, the Allies suddenly saw everything. Every patrol line, every wolfpack formation, every rendezvous point, and this newly gained omniscience transformed the Atlantic from a graveyard into a battlefield where the U-boats themselves became prey, stalked relentlessly by destroyers and long-range aircraft closing the gap with new technology. And soon German captains began to sense that something was wrong. Every time they surfaced to radio headquarters, Allied aircraft appeared within minutes. Every time they maneuvered to intercept a convoy, the convoy turned before they arrived. Every time they coordinated an attack, the enemy was already waiting, and rumors spread among U-boat crews that the Allies must have discovered a new radar capable of sensing them through clouds and storms. But the truth was simpler and far more devastating. Their messages were no longer theirs, their thoughts no longer private, their movements no longer unknown, and this realization began to infect the high command in Berlin, where Donitz, furious and exhausted, pounded the table during meetings, demanding answers from engineers, accusing officers of carelessness, insisting that there must be leaks, that someone, somewhere, was betraying Germany, because he refused to believe that Enigma, the machine he trusted above all else, could be cracked. And while the Germans spiraled into suspicion and paranoia, the codebreakers at Bletchley worked faster and faster, expanding intelligence from the Atlantic into Europe itself, illuminating German supply routes, revealing Luftwaffe deployment schedules, exposing troop movements before major battles, and perhaps most critically, providing the Allies with the information needed to plan entire operations with near-perfect foresight, including the crucial groundwork for the upcoming invasion of Europe, as every intercepted message became another piece of the puzzle. Another thread in a vast web of knowledge that would eventually guide the armies preparing to storm the continent. And though the public knew nothing, though the world outside Bletchley Park believed victory depended solely on tanks rolling across deserts or bombers streaking through the sky, the truth was that victory was being crafted quietly, line by line, inside wooden huts filled with tobacco smoke and the constant clatter of machines. And even as the war reached its darkest hours, the codebreakers pressed on, knowing that every delay meant death for thousands of sailors, soldiers, and civilians, and so they lived in a state of constant urgency. Barely sleeping, barely resting, bound together not by uniforms or rank but by a mission that transcended all else: protect the world by reading the enemy's mind. If you already watched till this part, so please comment below your city name. Let's continue the story. And as 1944 approached, the full magnitude of Bletchley Park's power became undeniable, for now the Allies were not merely reacting to German movements, they were anticipating them with such precision that entire German offensives collapsed before they even began, and nowhere was this more evident than in the preparations for Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, which depended not only on soldiers, tanks, and aircraft, but on knowledge of German coastal defenses, knowledge of troop placement, knowledge of how quickly reinforcements could move, and most critically, knowledge of the exact moment German commanders believed the invasion would occur. And thanks to ultra-intelligence, thanks to the quiet rooms where men and women worked tirelessly around the clock, the Allies knew the Germans expected an attack at Calais, not Normandy, allowing deception operations to flourish, fooling the Nazi high command into believing that inflatable tanks and fake radio chatter represented a real army, and this deception worked only because every German response, every adjustment, every assumption was monitored, decoded, and redirected, giving the Allies the confidence to strike where Hitler least expected them. And when the invasion began on June 6, 1944, the intelligence from Bletchley flowed like a river. Reports on German divisions held in place because they believed Patton was preparing an assault elsewhere, updates on Luftwaffe operations, details on U-boat movements near the English Channel, and even after the beaches were stormed and secured, the role of intelligence continued to shape the campaign, guiding Allied generals through the maze of German communication, revealing where panzer divisions were regrouping, where supply lines were weakening, where the Germans were preparing counterattacks, and so the war shifted rapidly, momentum turning against the Reich faster than anyone in Berlin could comprehend, with German commanders increasingly frustrated, increasingly suspicious, increasingly convinced that traitors were everywhere, because they could not imagine that their sacred machine, the Enigma they trusted more than any weapon, had become their greatest weakness. And as Allied armies pushed deeper into France, as the Luftwaffe shrank and the once mighty panzer forces grew thin and desperate, Hitler himself retreated further into paranoia, issuing erratic orders, firing experienced commanders, and demanding investigations into imaginary spy networks, all while refusing to consider that Enigma was compromised. And thus the German war effort became a tragic cycle of confusion, misdirection, and catastrophic decisions, each one influenced not by Allied strength alone but by the intelligence that allowed the Allies to be in the right place at the right time, striking with uncanny accuracy, maneuvering with a clarity Germany no longer possessed, for the truth was that the Nazi war machine had become blind, operating on fragmented information, unaware that nearly every strategic message was being read by their enemy. And meanwhile, back at Bletchley Park, the work only intensified, with machines running at full speed, decoding messages about secret weapons, last-ditch offensives, U-boat withdrawals, and desperate German attempts to reorganize shattered fronts. Yet even in these final months, victory was not assured, for the Germans still fought fiercely, and many feared that if the Nazis suspected the truth, if they realized their communications were exposed, they might alter their ciphers or devise a new system that could plunge the war back into chaos, so the Codebreakers maintained the illusion, ensuring that Allied responses never appeared too perfect, carefully hiding how deep their knowledge truly went, preserving ultra-secrecy at all costs. And when the war finally began to crack open under German collapse, when cities fell, when factories were bombed into silence, when the Reich began to crumble under the weight of Allied advances, it became clear that the conflict had been shaped not only by the clash of armies but by the quiet victories won in rooms where no bullets were fired, where the battle unfolded in patterns of letters and numbers rather than explosions, and eventually, when Germany surrendered in May 1945, when Europe stepped into its first breath of peace in 6 long years, the world still did not know the full truth, because Bletchley Park's existence remained classified, its heroes returning to ordinary lives, forbidden to speak of the war they had secretly guided, and decades later, when the story finally emerged, when historians revealed that a group of mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and ordinary citizens had built the most devastating intelligence weapon the world had ever seen, only then did the magnitude become clear. The Nazis had feared tanks, planes, bombs, and armies, but the weapon that undid them, the weapon that cut off their U-boats, crippled their strategies, and shattered their command structure, was intelligence, wielded not by soldiers on the battlefield but by brilliant minds working quietly in the shadows, proving that wars are not won only by firepower but by knowledge, precision, and the relentless pursuit of the enemy's secrets. And in that pursuit, Bletchley Park stood unmatched, the silent force that turned the tide of World War II and ensured that the Nazis would face a power they could never outthink, never outrun, and never truly understand. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.